And now look to the Treasurer, Stephen Horvath, New College, to open the case for the opposition.
June 2006. Markets are booming, and the phrase subprime mortgage was known only to Wall Streeters who were getting rich on risky loans made to homeowners with low credit ratings. The phrase subprime mortgages was not yet bandied around the newspapers or in the mouths of protesters. Bear Stearns, a global investment bank headquartered on Madison Avenue, was one of the leading players in the subprime mortgage market, selling billions of dollars of bundles of these risky mortgages onto third parties all over the world. Except they weren't risky mortgages. To use the language of an internal Bear Stearns email about one particular bundle of mortgages they sold in June 2006, they were a sack of shit, a shit breather. A Bear Stearns executive asked if this securitization was a going out of business sale. 60% of the mortgages in that bundle of securities were more than 30 days overdue on those payments. Please accept my apologies for swearing in this august chamber. I think it is necessary to capture the attitudes and practices of Wall Street in the run-up to 2008. The most prestigious financial institutions in the world weren't just fiddling with regulatory loopholes or making quick profits at the expense of America's poorest. They were knowingly selling absolutely worthless products to our pension funds, to our public sector insurance plans, and to our university endowment funds, and laughing behind our backs. They weren't just selling them on to innocent bystanders and taking advantage, but they were intimidating intermediary financial institutions. The same Bear Stearns email trove highlights a message written by a mortgage underwriter at another firm saying, "We have to start buying more. New York aren't happy with us." The top firms on Wall Street use their prestige and their intelligence to pressure the rest of the financial system to buy their products, setting up a global chain of liability. This isn't predatory banking. This is gangster racketeering and intimidation at its finest. Wall Street were undeniably to blame for the global financial crisis. Of course, governments, regulators, rating agencies all made mistakes and contributed to the 2008 crash. But the culture of excess on Wall Street had escalated beyond belief. Gone was the wheeler-dealer greed is good Gordon Gekko of the 1980s. And instead we had a system where the aim was to get rich off the losses of your own customers. But, ladies and gentlemen, even if you believe that Wall Street wasn't the prime cause of the global financial crisis, I invite you to side with the opposition, because blaming Wall Street was the best method of achieving change. But before I go into my argument, it falls on me to introduce our proposition for the evening. You've just heard from Molly Greenwood, the union secretary. Molly is a noted advocate for reform, which she helpfully defined for me the other day. Molly tells me reform is a verb, and it means to make changes in an institutional practice in order to improve it, which I didn't know before. But it's interesting to see that reform now means letting institutions off the hook for wiping out trillions of dollars of wealth and destroying the livelihoods of millions of people. All jokes aside, it's a pleasure to debate against Molly for the second time this year, and I thank her for opening the debate. Next up is Brenda Mcgrath. Brendan is a keen debater. Indeed, I first met Brendan when I was judging him at a school's debating competition 2 years ago, and I look forward to seeing the student become the master this evening. Over the vacation, when Brendan was working on this debate, it was an absolute joy to hear his beautiful Irish lilt calling up speakers, and I hope he brings his persuasive and charming tones to the podium tonight. Our first guest speaker is Petrolia, an accomplished entrepreneur with an immense wealth of experience in e-commerce. She has worked for some of the biggest names in the industry, as well as launching her own business lending site, Cabbage, in 2008, for which she was ranked as one of the 100 most powerful women by Forbes magazine. Our final speaker is Professor Karthik Ramana, an eminent academic and director of the MPP program at Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government. With over a decade of teaching experience at Harvard Business School, he is at the forefront of a focus on leadership and development at the intersection of the business and public sector issues, as well as a prolific writer of acclaimed case studies. These are your proposition speakers, Madam President, and they are most welcome. I am no expert in economic matters. I don't even study PPE. I only study history and politics. So I'll leave a detailed picture of the analysis of the exact chain of causality in a dangerous, oversaturated market to my eminent speakers on my side. But I do want to advance two arguments today. The first of those, that yes, there are many other problems, but banks are the primary cause of the crash's proportion. And second, that blaming Wall Street was a useful way to empower political change. But before that, I want to engage with some of the claims we've just heard in Molly's speech, two particular ones. The first, to clarify what the burden is on the proposition side to win this debate. On the proposition, they don't just have to tell you that governments played some role in the financial crisis, that ratings agencies and regulators made many mistakes. They have to convince you that banks didn't bear sole responsibility. Because no journalist, no politician, no protester ever said it was just banks. They said it was Wall Street and the system it created. That's the argument that they need to be advancing this evening. The second is a more substantive response to Molly's argument that the problem with the financial system was that we didn't separate consumer banks from investment banks. No doubt this played a part, but I want to make 2 points in response. Firstly, investment banks that were strictly investment only and had no role in consumer banking went under in the crash and indeed caused the crash. I don't know of anyone who banked with Lehman Brothers or Bear Stearns at a consumer level, but it was these investment banks who didn't have a consumer branch that were still able to carry out risky practices. But secondly, even if we did have complete separation of consumer banks and investment banks, it was the ability of investment banks to design these products and sell them to other groups, insurance groups, private equity funds, all sorts of groups, and disseminate them throughout our financial system that caused the problem. It's a nice solution to say, oh, if only Bill Clinton hadn't repealed the Glass-Steagall Act. But simply, it isn't enough, and it's not going to win this debate. So, those two arguments. First, there can be no doubt that throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, the government had an irresponsible attitude towards income inequality, towards the housing market, towards credit, particularly after the dot-com bubble. There can be no doubt that many hard-working, ordinary people were the victims of irresponsible real estate agents and poor loan vetting practices at local banks. But, ladies and gentlemen, housing markets always crash. They always rise, they always fall. Local banks often make mistakes. This is simply not the cause of a global crash that wiped out $11 trillion of wealth. Crucially, the difference here was that a localized housing crash that happened in some states in America was facilitated to have a global impact because of the banks. Because when a bank creates a collateralized debt obligation, which is a parcel of a bunch of these risky mortgages, and sells it to the National Bank of Iceland, and sells it to consumer banks in Ireland, what they are doing is they are spreading the risk from a few poorly made loans in Florida all around the world. And that's what normally doesn't happen. Sure, in 2008, we could have had a collapse in the property market in Florida, and people could have lost their homes, which would have been undoubtedly a tragedy. But it wouldn't have been a global political economic catastrophe in the same way, and it wouldn't have had an international nature unless it was because of the banks. And I crucially think that's why this debate has to focus on Wall Street and not on Washington. Because this debate isn't about an economic downturn in America. It's about a crisis that wiped out overnight the economies of many leading European nations, that had a huge impact around the entire world. It's that international nature that was enabled by the global interconnectivity of leading financial institutions. Secondly, why? Even if I know nothing about economics and you think I'm wrong about why there was a crash, you should agree with me. Because the focus on bankers has been the only way to unite political consensus. This is for two reasons. Firstly, because it is unbelievably easy to vilify people who made hundreds of millions of dollars whilst other people were joining bread lines because they had lost their jobs and their insurance overnight. That sort of vilification, whilst it can be dangerous, is incredibly useful in creating the sort of dynamic protest movements we needed in response to a financial crisis that had disempowered and disenfranchised people. That sort of vilification is what brought together people from left and right, from Labour and Conservative, from Democrat and Republican, to say enough is enough, and we need to regulate these banks, and we need to tax these banks, and we need to sort out our financial system. Crucially, whilst there are many different political responses to the financial crisis, they weren't partisan in the same way. Most of the partisan political disputes we've had in the early days after 2008 were about austerity and funding and government stimulus. They weren't about should we regulate the banks, a question on which almost all people, even die-hard conservatives, were willing to give some ground. So by turning people anger against banks, politicians were able to, in their ever-so-reptilian manner, to unite themselves behind popular anger and against bankers. It was crucially that shifting dynamic that enabled there to be popular reform. I think the second caveat, there's a caveat worth noting here. It's not that by focusing on banks, we didn't pay any attention to the mistakes and actions of government. It's that by focusing on banks, we looked at the system they created. Yes, Molly is absolutely right to talk about campaign finance reform, a loophole that we can place in no small part at the foot of Wall Street. But on top of that, one of the things that was exposed most directly in 2008 was the revolving door. Sure, our regulating agencies were doing poorly. That was because they were primarily staffed by former employees of Goldman Sachs. That's a problem that began on Wall Street that then unfortunately was exported to Washington. We can see that again and again, that by focusing on Wall Street, we unearth the wider political nature of the controversy, and we're able to examine that more effectively. When the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission of the US government published its report in 2010, there were more than 26 million Americans who were out of work, could not find work, or had given up looking for work. About 4 million of those families has lost their homes due to foreclosure, and another 4.5 million have slipped into the foreclosure process. Nearly $11 trillion of household wealth has vanished, with retirement accounts and life savings swept away. In response to this, calls for political reform that were unlikely to succeed would have been an irresponsible waste of our political capital, and we had to unite immediately behind the biggest threat to our future prosperity. But most importantly, I want to conclude with a more subtle argument, that we must blame Wall Street in order to save Wall Street. When functioning healthily, investment banks play a crucial role in our economy. They help create the growth that is felt in the pocket of all people when our economy is working. They finance the innovation we need to stay competitive and improve our lives. And they help ordinary people save to fund their retirement. Yet when the system goes so badly wrong, Wall Street has the power to do terrible things to the lives of ordinary people. Through the sustained attacks on bankers and Wall Street, we have been able to create a better regulatory framework, to increase the scrutiny imposed on financial transactions, and to strengthen the mechanism in place to prevent the total collapse of our financial system in the event of one part collapsing. We were right to blame Wall Street for causing a crisis with global fallout and devastating consequences. A crisis that was uniquely set up by the risky mortgages they distributed across the financial system. We were right to point the finger at banks who used their wealth to influence rating agencies and rewrite regulations. We are still right today to hold banks to higher standards and use our anger at them to push the government to better regulations. Ladies and gentlemen, we are right to stand in opposition to this motion and firmly stand alongside those who lost their homes, those who lost their jobs, and those who lost their savings, all because some clever people on Wall Street had a laugh whilst making millions of financial products they designed collapsing in their own hands. Thank you very much.